You're busy, you've got a decent practice, but nobody wants to be decent. You want to be great, and you want to have a great practice. So how did the most productive, profitable dentist in the nation balance real life, work, and profits, and somehow make it all seem fun? Well, it comes down to simple, everyday practices. So grab a lunch, join us as we chat with top clinicians and influencers to discover their formula for uncommon success. Are you ready? Then it's time to explore everyday practices with Vicki McManus-Peterson and Dr. Chad Johnson.
Hey everybody, this is Everyday Practices with Chad Johnson. I'm here solo today without Vicki, but we're interviewing Chris Moriarity from Productive Dentist Academy. And Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Vicki was in sunny Hawaii. I talked to her earlier today, and we were going to try not to be too jealous of her as we sit in our windy winter wonderlands.
Nice.
That was it.
Yes. Hey, Chris, so I met you 4 years ago, and I was doing okay enough, but also, like, when I say that, I don't know if I'm just trying to keep a little pride to it, because the truth be told, I mean, for once, I was willing to admit that I was in need of you guys' help. And it was so comforting to talk to you. What kind of call do you normally get from that first customer that's kind of kicking the tires?
Well, it's interesting. We were actually just going over some of this data at the end of the year. Like any business, we want to know who we attract and who we serve and how we can better serve those people. And the realities of the numbers often kind of conflict with your memories. Like in my mind, if someone would ask me, I would have said, oh my gosh, we attract this type of practice or that type of practice. But the reality is most people are about 9 years in who wind up contacting PDA for the first time.
That's right where I was.
Oh, well, there you go. So it kind of makes sense. And the reason I think a lot of people go that long is they're doing okay. They're growing. So there's no real big red flags. They know that there's going to be a learning curve in the beginning. But as long as the practice isn't on fire, there isn't any real need to reach out per se. So I think when these folks finally do kind of come to that conclusion that, given the amount of effort and investment that I put into this practice, the outcome should be different. And once they kind of sit in that seat for a while, that's when they pick up the phone and we start to dig a little deeper.
And if anything, I don't even think at the time that I was considering that I wasn't treating my patients as good as I could because I didn't know any better. So if we rewind 4 years back, you would have said, Chad, are you treating your patients good? Yes, of course. But when I look at it now and how we go through everything, it's so cool to see that not only have you increased my bottom line and my take home or whatever on the financial side, but that I'm also able to provide better care to the patients. And I think what's interesting now that we're starting January is talking about end of year review. And as you had brought up before we began the recording, talking about data-driven decision making. And one of the things that I used to do is make an Excel sheet and try and track some data here and there. But I've seen the work that you can pull out of a hat, and let alone when I can give you some of my month-to-month data and some of the decisions that you can make. What have you in the last year been finding with your new MBA and about how you can help dentists become better at their business decision making?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is the conversations that I have with, even though the average, as I mentioned earlier, was 9 years, I would still say that the next majority is certainly folks who are right around that 0 to 5 years. And it's one of those things where you can't blame people for what they don't know.
Yeah.
They haven't had exposure to alternatives in about anything in the practice outside of some of the general clinical guidance that you would naturally seek out, wanting to be better at the craft itself. And as we've worked with businesses over time, we were no different. There are things that you just feel in your gut, where you'll say that this doesn't seem right, or that it should be different and I can't figure out how to change it. And
even if I wanted to.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason that I started really pouring myself and just dedicating a lot of my time to sort of mastering more of the data analytics side of what we do is because it made me feel less crazy. Like, to be quite honest, it was, we knew these things, but I didn't know how to prove it. And even if I could prove it, I didn't know how to change it. And so by being able to kind of put a roadmap in front of people, it just takes the stress way down. because it sucks the emotion out. The nice thing about these graphs and the way that these things come together is it's not really a measurement of good or bad. It's just a very clear roadmap on the state of the state and what we've built. And if you look at the practice like a machine, what's that machine capable of? Just like a car. You know, some cars are very, very good at going 50 miles an hour. Very few cars are very good at going 200 miles an hour.
Yes.
So when you want to go faster, they just need different mechanisms. It's time to change out the engines, get better tires, and things that have the tolerances
Gear
that can
ratios.
handle
Yeah.
Exactly. So in kind of seeking these things out, kind of one of the unintended outcomes was really shining a light on behavior. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. This gentleman called me up, it was probably 2-3 weeks ago now, and he had just purchased a practice from a gentleman who'd ran it for 30 years. It was his baby. And he just couldn't figure out why he couldn't connect with any of the patients. It wasn't getting good case acceptance. Like attrition was really abnormally high, and it shouldn't have been, because the whole practice looked great on paper. So we started digging deeper into some of the numbers, going back to what the previous owner had done. And all of a sudden, something became very, very evident. One of the first things I look for in the practice is the old 80-20. And for those of you who aren't familiar, in any business, not just dentistry, about 80% of the revenues are coming from 20% of the patients. So I want to know who those people are. What do they tend to spend? How wide is that margin? Or is it very, very slim? In younger practices, it's a pretty thin band, and it usually gets wider as practices mature. But in this particular practice, looking at that previous owner, for about the 3 years running up to the sale, 52% of his treatment plans were $952 almost on the nose. So, and this was not what he was diagnosing. This was the entire treatment plan as presented to the patient. So that tells me pretty clearly that this gentleman, and I'm not here to judge his clinical ability, or it's his right as a medical practitioner to do whatever he sees fit. That's not for me to judge. But the probability, the likelihood that 52% of the population of that town only needed a single tooth, and 52% of them also needed a crown, it just
peculiar.
It doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. It certainly would raise an eyebrow. So this gentleman who had been educated by folks like PDA, who strongly encourage, doing that full mouth diagnosis, that your job is to tell the patients everything that you see, because the patients deserve to know what's going on in their mouth. So he walks in, and all of a sudden he just can't figure out why he's getting derailed. And once we figured that out, it was because these patients had been conditioned to come in and only one tooth needed attention. They diagnosed that one, insurance covered it all, and off they went. So now here comes this young guy in there where the treatment plans are obviously significantly higher, and they think that he's trying to hustle them or trying to do whatever it was. And so for him, one simple shift was to just start giving context. And in PDA, the terminology we use is handle the objection before it's the objection. So he's not completely familiar with PDA strategies in terms of risk factors and ballparking and all that. But one of the things that we coached him to do just right out of the gates is just spend a few more minutes with the patient explaining your process and how dentistry has changed and what you want to share with them, and to tell them, especially if you're a student of Canberra and risk factors and whatnot, and John Coyce, who will tell you that if you see something in the mouth, you can't be too quick to judge, the state of that, because it may have been there for 10 years, may have been there for 15 years. Like, we don't really know.
It's progression and why. Right.
Exactly. So as long as he can set the stage to say, I'm just going to tell you everything that I see, then we're going to come up with a plan to treat you. And just on a 2-week follow-up, it was already just night and day. So it's a clear example of just a simple pattern that we detected in that previous dentist behavior that manifested in this data that explained why he was having such a hard time. Now, knowing that,
getting out of his funk, basically.
Exactly, and just being able to alter his communication a little bit and get himself on a better relationship footing with those patients. And I think
that's
that
awesome.
a lot of the reasons that people get relief and the stress goes down is because of the fact that, like I said earlier, in their gut they know something's off. It can't be them. Like it can't be just that you caught this this specific practice with this group of patients who all just hate you. Like that's so unlikely. And so being able to figure out that no, there was this barrier that we just couldn't see is so much easier.
And Chris, just recently I got red flagged by insurance within the last year, and I can't prove this because it's not like they say, yes, indeed you are. But anytime that we do two onlays that are sequenced right next to each other, for example, tooth number 12 and 13, if I do two onlays right next to each other, boy, it's a problem for certain insurances that also make faucets in the brand name. And that said company, they will look at my claims, and if I were to do only tooth number 12, no problem. And if I were to only do tooth number 13, no problem. But what we were just talking about over lunch today was we got one denial that came back, and 12 and 13 were denied. And and I said, what the insurance is trying to do is condition us because we've resubmitted it. I think we've resubmitted it three times total. So what they're trying to say is, okay, go to the patient and explain to them, that you are at odds with the insurance, and then the patient gets upset. And who are they upset with? Rarely are they, like, man, that insurance, they're upset with me. And so then I get upset, and then I think to myself, I don't like that upset feeling. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just do one crown. And so what we should do is treatment plan to that patient. Why don't we do one this year and one next year? And sure enough, it's falling into just what Gordon Christensen talks about, that there's one crown a year that's done. And that's the norm for 95% of crowns made in labs. Is when I'm doing two, something red flag goes up. This guy's an outlier. We don't like that. Let's punish and condition him. Now, again, if this is strictly paranoia, my apologies, but there's a good amount of people that would agree with me that there's something going on there. And it's not just how we accept the patient's nonverbal cues and everything that comes with the psychosocial factors of the patient interaction. It also has to do with the insurance and how they're trying to condition us to treatment plan.
Well, and your suspicions are spot on. It's because, and this is, when you look at any entity of a certain size that is primarily quantitatively driven, like an insurance company, like a credit card company, like banks and whatnot, their algorithms are set to do two things. It's 100% intentional. That yes, they want to be able to capture, manipulate their data and see what those outliers are. And in part, a lot of their kickback is going to be to prevent fraud and prevent anomalies and see when things like don't make sense. But it's also to do exactly what you're saying, which is to change behavior. And it feels conspiratorial because it is. And in fact, one of my favorite examples in the world is Geico, auto insurance. Do you remember when they ran those big campaigns where they would say, come to our website and we want you to check out our rates. Sometimes we're the best deal and sometimes we're not. And if we're not, we'll tell you who is. Now, they say the messaging around that is we're good guys.
We're honest.
We're honest and we're transparent. What they're really doing is they're checking your driving record. And if you are in a higher risk category, it artificially inflates your rates to push you out. It's not your true rate. They bump it up to say, oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Today, we're not the best deal.
They're pushing you out of the funnel.
Deal. Exactly. But their perception, they've maintained exactly what you're saying when it comes to who's shifting the blame. They're still the good guys. Oh, shoot, I couldn't get in with the good guys. I guess I'll have to go over here. But I don't blame them. What it's really saying is we don't think that you're good enough to be here, so we're going to raise our rate so you can't come here because we only want the best drivers and we'll de-incentivize the bad ones to this point. So,
and Chris, isn't it so interesting that we don't, as dental offices, we don't try and work on the outliers to offset our risk either?
Well, and that's just it, because and part of it too, the data collection capabilities of a dental office were very limited up until recently, where not a lot of people had the diligence to sit down and bang things out in a spreadsheet like you did. And even that, I mean, how many lifetimes would it take for you to not only invest as much time as you have into developing the business side and the clinical side of your practice, but then also learn to be a data scientist on top of that.
Have the sample size as well. Every dentist is only working with 2,000 patients as opposed to 200,000 and then looking at the metadata.
Exactly. So all of a sudden now that we have various softwares that are out there that can aggregate data, now that we have ways that we can simulate, once we have like even with an average dental practice, and this is something that I did for your practice once, where I said, if I've got 2,000 various data points that's statistically relevant enough to run quite a few models. So what you can do is you can pull out various chunks of that and then put it into a simulator, what they would refer to in the financial world as a Monte Carlo simulation. And I would say, what happens if these 2,000 patient profiles came in for 1 million visits? And so I can simulate masses of data to get me more accurate without having to pull from every office in the United States. So this is something that it's done commonly, but in the financial world and other sectors, but it's pretty new to dentistry. But now that we're pulling some of these things in, the actionable intelligence is unbelievable. But when we look at the insurance, again, knowing that and being able to predict what that insurance company is trying to do gives us power. And being able to have that conversation with your patient to say, as an insurance company, here's what they assume. They assume that most patients are going to want to do a tooth at a time, and reinforcing that stuff. So when we come in, where most of our patients who come in here are interested in getting healthy. And so sometimes that's at odds with what the insurance company wants to do. So don't be alarmed if they kick back on one of these, because they're testing us, because it seems weird. What? Somebody wants to get healthy? That's crazy. Not in America. And then you get a laugh out of it. And usually you can go on and on and on, but kind of preparing them for that eventuality can be a powerful thing. But it's interesting when we're looking at this data, and part of one of the things that in dentistry, I've found that a lot of folks will figure out what works, and they kind of stay right there, and in that kind of good enough zone when it comes to their communication. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about you and your practice is the continual improvement. You're different in the sense that you have a natural curiosity that expands beyond the clinical, where I've met many, many doctors whose curiosity expands back into the dentistry. When there's a new technique that comes out, like, they're excited and they really want to learn that technique, but they don't spend an equivalent amount of time, number one, on the business, but also number three, I guess you should say, is on various communication elements. And then being able to apply that to the data and figure out if there is a better way, if there is a simpler way.
Definitely the guys that do best are going to be when change is the norm.
Absolutely.
Well, think about a guy that does the same dentistry the same way for 30 years. And like you said, it's safe for that way. But, one thing that's helped in our office is we had an assistant that left when I had an associate leave. She went on maternity leave extended. And when she came back about a year and a half later, she was like, man, this is the same office, but it's different. What happened? I've got to learn all these new protocols, but it's the office I just left.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, you looked at my data. Chris, you looked at my data, and one of the findings that you had with my stats was that my case closings were the worst with my cohort, my age group. Isn't that interesting? How did you come up with that, and what did you find?
Yeah, and so that was one of the first things that I usually run on most practices these days. And what I refer to it as is I kind of collectively use the term the danger zone. And so I look at two different things. I look at outstanding treatment plans that folks either did a portion of or they've done none of, the think about it, the talk to my spouses who kind of disappear. So who's most likely to kind of leave? And then I take that data and I run it through in terms of what are the commonalities. And beyond just who's saying yes, I look a little bit deeper and I try to find any correlation between their zip code, their age, their income, basically anything that I can find. Then you lay that on top of, I try to get at least 30 months worth of data. Then I lay it on top of the people who do tend to say yes. So here's the say no's versus the say yeses. And then you run, you run a data analysis called an ANOVA, which is basically comparing these various things and finding the intensities of the correlations. And what you can pinpoint is kind of that ideal patient profile and then the opposite. meaning like when you sit across from a certain person,
your nemesis.
These people tend to say yes. These people don't tend to say yes. And I think in your case, you're one of the most affable, likable guys on the planet. But there's a chance that when you sit across from somebody that you see as a peer, your behavior might change.
Yeah.
You might not explain things as thoroughly as you would to somebody in their 60s or somebody who knows what it was, but it seems pretty logical that could be happening, that something there is different. But it could also be that somebody who sits across from you doesn't want to admit certain financial limitations. They're uncomfortable having that conversation with somebody that they see as that they should be on par with, and they don't feel like they're on par with. I mean, there's a million different psychological explanations to it. But when you have an associate like you do, who is of a different profile, younger, she's female, communicates differently, to where built up to the top level, when you know that one of these patients is coming in, well, then don't put them in your chair.
Yes.
You put them with Emily. And see if that makes a difference, and run that for 30, 40 days and see if those numbers do start to climb up, because she's going to have the exact same situation to where when that profile that's least likely to say yes to her, put those in your chair, and you can start moving a lot of these various things around. Now, when recently a good buddy of ours, he's got two associates, and not uncommon. The owner's generally going to be the dominant producer. That's not going to be a surprise to anybody. But when it comes to kind of feeding this associates, I have a specific threshold that I need to meet in terms of profitability, to where, and the more and more time I spend on the associate issue, it's amazing how difficult it is to make that truly profitable, without really lassoing a unicorn. That we have one gentleman in Colorado who has an associate that does $1,000 an hour. That's an absolute unicorn. I've never seen anybody else come close, at least not systematically. They might hit it 1 or 2 months, but not like this. You can't build a business around that. So,
well, Chris, it's kind of like this. My brother is in realty, and he says that they call them rainmakers. And a rainmaker is kind of, I suppose, if you were to make it into a tribal kind of scenario, but they get the term that the person producing the most kind of is the guy or gal that helps set up the whole culture and the ambiance to where it's raining. You know, it's raining dollars in your office because they're the high producer. And you also, he'll joke around that he'll say, I want to get someone to come work with me as an associate, but I don't want them to be too good. I just want them to be good enough. And that can also be tough with an associate, is, you know, finding someone that's going to be producing $2,000 an hour their first year out of school. If they're not buying into your office, they're probably going to be starting their own pretty soon too. So it's a double-edged sword.
Well, yeah, I can tell you exactly when that happens. So if an associate comes in and they're pretty green, now there are those associates or folks who are on the back end of their career, maybe sold their practice, they just want to stay active. Like there are a few of those folks, but they're certainly rarer. Yeah. Right. Good word. So with these younger folks, if they're coming in, you know, half of them are producing on par with hygiene. I mean, it's pretty flat.
Wow.
So the goal I found is if they're right around that 250, maybe getting up to that 300 range, you know, that's fairly steady. Getting them up to 550 to 600 is really, in my experience, been about the top threshold, to where the office can make a return. But beyond 600, right around 650, 700, that's when they tend to bail. That's when these folks leave and go set up shop somewhere else because they know that they can do it. And so now they walk out the door, your business takes a $500,000 hit overnight, and you got to replace them, and then so on and so forth. So the reason that I've become so anal, for lack of a better term, over the teachable communications elements and case presentation and financial option stuff that I'll share with you in a second, my goal for any owner is to be able to hire an associate solely based on clinical skill, because it's the easiest thing that we can evaluate when they come in. You can sit side by side, you can put x-rays up, you can do those things and see what they know. because we can teach them the rest. If we have to spend our careers trying to find these natural communicators who just can get along with anybody, that's going to be really, really hard and really, really hard to replace. So if we can nail down the communication element and take that stress away from them, because when I talk to these associates, they'll tell you categorically that the dentistry stresses them out way less than the communication element.
Sure.
So if we can make sure that the business is protected from the sense of you have the best dentistry, the best clinical dentistry walking out those doors, and they're willing to practice the communication element, we can get anybody up to a reasonable, that 500 range. It shouldn't take very long. So if we focus on truncating the time that it takes to get them up there, then we're less fearful of that inevitable revolving door. Because otherwise I see owners who've, worked their butts off thinking that they got to carve out equity for somebody who flat out didn't earn it because they're too scared of having to replace them or whatever else it is. And you can't have that fear driver or it's just not going to work. So
you're right.
With one group of associates that I just worked with, they came from sort of a traditional case presentation option. And the worst version of this was not them at all, but the worst version of this is here's everything that I see. And they look to the patient and they say, what would you like to do? And this is frighteningly common because of the fact that you've just handed the reins to what's going to happen to the person in the room with the least education on the topic. Like
what's really interesting, Chris? I just read this book. I'm reading it, The Way of the Wolf, and Jordan, what's his name? Shoot,
Peterson?
He was saying uncertainty. What is it? That's it.
Jordan Belfort,
the Wolf of Wall Street. So, so he was saying that his straight line selling has to do with trying to have the customer have no uncertainty about three things. Number one, the company itself. Number two, the product, and number three, the person that's selling it to them. If there's any uncertainty along any one of those 3 points, it's going to make the sale a lot harder. If you have complete certainty of the company that you're buying from, this person that's selling it on behalf of that company, and the actual product, you can't mess it up. Isn't that interesting? So when you said uncertainty, a little flag went off about that book that I'm currently reading.
It's so relevant, and it can't be understated as it relates to the medical community. Before I worked with dentists, I worked with physicians, and they were some of the hardest, and I can tell you who's the worst. It's neurologists and cardiologists are the worst. In terms of, it's very difficult for them to learn from anybody that they don't perceive as more educated or smarter or something that's kind of on their level, because they have to condition themselves to be
you're
at a
always
certain
getting
level
sold to. That's the trouble with dentists. You're always getting sold to. So someone else comes in and says, "Hey, I'd like to sell something to you." It's like, get in line, man.
Oh yeah, you guys get that more than most. But think about the realities of being a heart surgeon, or the realities of being a spinal surgeon or neurosurgeon. When you look at somebody and you can't be like, it might be a tumor. You can't say that. You have to go in and be like, either we're cutting you open or we're not. When I'm in there, I can't be wishy-washy, because when your chest is spread wide open enough to shoot a basketball into it, you're on the clock. So everything that they do comes from this incredible amount of certainty, but they've conditioned themselves to the point that it makes them very inflexible to be able to shift and be able to work in new strategies, new thoughts and ideas. And it was very much a challenge for them, but you're exactly right. So as it relates back to these associates, what they thought they were doing was having no pressure. The patient knows, I've educated them to the point where they can make a good decision. No, they won't. People don't make good decisions. That is not what human beings are known for, evidenced by every fast food restaurant on every corner, next to every liquor store on every corner, and and whatever else it is. You make terrible decisions, especially as it relates to their health, let alone their money. So with these, what they didn't understand, and what I had to help them understand, is that our brains are wired to be as efficient as possible. And where our brains invest most of its resources are on the things that are most likely to happen to us. So think about this in terms of money. As you're bouncing around the community just in your daily life, most of your expenditures are probably going to be between $0 and $500, right? A pair of shoes, going to a movie, grabbing some groceries, so we learn how to evaluate those things. And what I had to demonstrate to them is, now let's go on the other end of the scale. Let's go on to probably the largest financial transaction of the average person's life, which is buying a house.
Yes.
When you're buying a house, or when you're negotiating for a house, you don't do it in increments of $50. You do it in increments of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, these huge swings, and we don't agonize over that. Versus, let's go back to the other end. If you're at a restaurant and you're on a date, how much agony is there between, is she going to pick the $20 chicken or the $60 lobster? That's a $40 difference. But all of a sudden we know, we're like, oh, like that feels expensive, and no, $20 seems way better for that. That's where our agony lives, because that's where our experience lives. So our brain is conditioned to think in those terms. So what I had to help them understand is that as they're presenting these treatment plans, we don't want to leave it wide open. You want to give them an A or a B. And A is going to be their most likely choice, and B is basically going to be the full enchilada. But what what A needs to be is a minimum of twice what their insurance will cover, if it's clinically warranted. If they don't need much, well, then obviously we're not diagnosing things for fun. It has to be ethical and whatnot. But the reason for that is, again, I had to explain to them that to the patient psychologically, the difference between $2,700 and $3,400, it's not really that different. They don't agonize it nearly as much as they would between that $40 and $60. And so they're running this right now, and they've only been doing it for 1 week now. And I had them work in a couple other strategies as well, and the feedback's already coming in. And once you can rely on that, and this is one of those things to where, going back to that level of confidence in that inflexibility in trying new things, what was interesting was, of the 3 doctors in this practice, the owner, the one that is probably most cemented in his ways, was the first to jump in.
Oh,
and
interesting.
say, I'm going to try these things. I'm going to try it, and I'm going to dedicate. And he's got the most to lose because his production's the highest. You know, he is the dominant provider there. But guess what? It's working. It's working. And that's why I love the data, because the data told us, because you can look at it. You can look at it in anyone's practice, and you can say, what are these tolerances? Is there a tolerance difference between the people who said yes between these ranges? And you can measure it. And you can say, really, there's no difference between this range. So when it's within here, I can bump what I'm going to recommend basically up to this threshold, and I shouldn't expect a fall off in case acceptance of any real meaningful level.
So Chris, for the listeners, let me make sure that they understand this. So what you're saying is that you take their data and then you review it and you let them know, okay, when you treatment plan this much, and it could just be whatever amount, let's say it's $10,000, your case acceptance is 5%. And then when you treatment plan 7,000 to 3,000, your case acceptance might be 90%. So there's something going on between that 7 and 10. But what's cool is, rather than just saying, I've noticed that it seems like, I feel like you're actually taking objective data and making practically letting the business owner, the dentist themselves, make that decision, because they get when you're talking about tolerances, that there's certain drop-offs, that it's not a linear progression of case acceptance versus case denial.
Exactly.
Bring your lunch or take us to the gym again next week to improve your everyday practices. Also, subscribe on iTunes, follow us on social media, and sign up for our email list. Now get out there and win with everyday practices.